these are all constructs. And as these constructs fail, we'll start to see that it's all a lot muddier and a lot grayer than we give it credit for. It's just that we struggle to let go of those concepts because we don't quite understand how to free fall without dying.
I am Kay Anderson, and you are listening to Lost Spaces, a podcast that mourns the death of queer nightlife. Every episode, I talk to a different person about a venue from their past, the memories they created there, and the people that they used to know. Jess McAvoy is a Brooklyn-based performing artist, songwriter, and musician who was born in Perth, Western Australia. Before they moved to the Big Apple, they lived for a number of years in Melbourne, forging their way on the Australian music scene. We kind of meandered all over the place in this conversation, and although we started talking about the lesbian bar Glasshouse, we settled on the mixed night Queer and Alternative, or Q&A, which ran from 1996 to 2013 on Thursday nights at the Builders Arms on Gertrude Street in Collingwood, Melbourne.
So I grew up in Perth in the 90s. I was there from when I was born till 94, and then I went to Holland for 5 years and came back when I was. No, I'm lying. I left when I was 10, came back when I was 14. So from 14 to 20, I was in Perth, and then from 20 to 31, I was in Melbourne.
Mm-hmm. And so for those that don't know, Perth and Melbourne are on opposite sides of Australia, and Melbourne is maybe somewhat more exciting.
Depends
That's
on what
my
you
expert
do for
opinion.
excitement.
Well, sure. Yeah, but do you remember your first kind of days in Melbourne and what that felt like?
I do quite distinctly. I hadn't been there before I moved there when I was 19, so it was a pretty wonderful experience. I remember the first time I actually went into the Central Business District and popped out. I'd caught a train there from not that far away when I think about it in hindsight, but it felt like a way away, and popped out at Flinders Street Station. And I remember being 19 and looking around and feeling so overwhelmed by how many people were on the street in Melbourne in comparison to Perth. Of course, now living in New York, it's a completely different game. But I'd taken on Melbourne as an independent person for the first time in my life, and it really did feel like the world was at my fingertips, and I was going to be whoever I wanted to be in that moment. Like, it sounds pretty corny, but I still remember that. I was 19. It was electric. It felt like endless possibility at the time.
And so, did you move primarily because of music, or were there other reasons?
100%. Yeah, 100%. I mean, in part, I was, and of course, again, hindsight is 2020. But a big part of me was leaving for the sake of getting away from my family, getting away from my mother. And Melbourne was the center of it. If I wanted to be a musician and a serious artist, that was really the only option in Australia at the time. So I jumped in a car at 19 and drove for 4 days with a friend to get across the Nullarbor.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
wow.
I did it. I did the Nullarbor, yeah.
4 days. What were your main takeaways about the difference between the queer scenes in Perth and Melbourne?
It's a funny thing. It's very, in my memory, it's very tempered with the different states of who I was at those times. Perth, I was really fortunate when I was in Perth because I became part of the music scene there when I was 16. And so I started getting exposed to pub culture and nightlife pretty early. So by the time I started to recognize that there was a burgeoning queerness in me, I was sort of accessing it through the lens of music and from working in bars. So I started to meet, there was this wonderful organization called Women in Music in Perth at the time, and one of the women who ran the night was the first person that I fell in love with who wasn't a boy. And so it was kind of through the lens of music. So the access point was a lot sort of smoother, I think, than if I had been deliberately looking for somewhere to go or places to learn how to be queer. Because of course, as you remember, we didn't have the internet back then. So it was a very different approach to kind of figure out these things and to look for some kind of community. So through that, I don't know. I mean, I remember accessing a couple of spaces like the Court Hotel in North Perth, which had a sort of a section that had the pool table in it, which was lovingly referred to as the fishbowl, because of course all of the lesbians would hang out in that room because it had the pool table in it.
This is a recurring theme in my interviews, I just have to say. No matter where you go in the world, if there's a pool table, that's where they expect the women to go.
You know, and I'm not mad at it. I mean, there's something about doing something constructive while connecting with someone. I think, you know, I mean, I've thought about this a lot because as someone who has kind of shifted identity in the queer scene quite a bit throughout my life, you know, now I identify as non-binary. And so, you know, that puts me in what category am I in now? Like I still predominantly like to be romantic with women, but I'm not a dyke anymore. And that feels much better. But I think that I do think a lot about how segregated the queer scene has always seemed to be. You know, by binary gender. And I think that's not, it just sort of makes a little bit more sense to me where the motivations are slightly different when you try to build some kind of a rapport with someone where the first port of call isn't necessarily let's go and fuck somewhere. You know, the pool table makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah,
you know?
Although it is also a good space to fuck on.
It depends on how many balls are on the table. Always the one. Depends on how many balls are on the table. Yeah. So being in Perth and you know, that was really cool to kind of learn how to play pool with a bunch of people. I mean, I've always liked doing constructive things in social spaces, so I don't know. I think, you know, and because I was young then too, and it all still felt a little bit naughty, and I hadn't really admitted to myself that I was gay. I mean, that sort of stayed a difficult topic for me well into my late 20s. So when I think about the contrast between Perth and Melbourne, it's actually more about a contrast of a feeling of a certain kind of freedom or a certain kind of secrecy. It's more about sort of my feelings of those experiences than the actual spaces themselves, I think.
Yeah. Okay.
And I remember that there was like one situation. There was a what was it called? Connie's Connections in Perth. Connie's, and I just remember being there, and I was probably 18 with a bunch of people, and then my maths teacher from my high school rocked up with my old geography teacher, and they were like, you know, making out on the dance floor, and the geography teacher was married to a woman and all this stuff. It was all super controversial, but I don't know, the bleed between childhood and deviance and trying to define yourself in a place where you already had a definition is kind of what Perth felt like, versus Melbourne felt more like self-definition, you know?
Okay. It's really interesting, your reflections on that. I want to say gateway, but maybe that's the wrong word, into kind of better understanding your own identity by being exposed to other people's identities, because I had the same type of thing with music. And I think when you're like, the acoustic scene especially has quite a number of kind of queer identifying women that certainly I looked up to when I was kind of coming through that scene and had as kind of a reference point. I mean, you know, not to mention all of that music that came out of the 90s as well.
Well, right. I mean, and that you make a really good point in that respect, where that was a time where we had this huge influx of these really powerful women in music. I mean, that's when the Spice Girls came out, but that wasn't just their doing. Like, this was part of a larger wave where, you know, Alanis Morissette had the highest selling debut album of any artist of all time, female artist of all time at that time. You know, Garbage was around, Bjork, PJ Harvey, like all these really powerful feminine figures. And So yeah, I mean, for me, discovering my identity. Plus, I toured with Ani DeFranco around that time, and was doing stuff with the Waifs, and so it all feels very intertwined to me, because a lot of my holding my identity close to my chest was very much motivated by not wanting to lose my music career. And so it wasn't so much me moving into the world and going, oh, where's my queerness? How does that fit into my life? It was like, oh, shit, I have this thing that's going on with me that is evidence to be dangerous to me and to everything that I aspire to. Because there's just too many examples still in Australian culture. I mean, it's shifting rapidly right now because there is a corporate interest in diversity, but but at the
Cha-ching.
time it was really bad. And I experienced firsthand quite a few things where, I mean, I lost the interest of several record companies at the peak of my career because they discovered that I was, in quotations, a dyke. So yeah, it was never really I mean, it's not simple for anyone, and I'm sure everybody's circumstances are incredibly convoluted, especially around that time in the world. But yeah, it's connected to so much about all of the choices in my life.
Yeah, so that's really interesting then. So you made a conscious decision to downplay when presenting yourself as an artist.
Yeah, I felt that I had to. And anytime I spoke about the subjects of my songs, it was always playing the pronoun game, as they'd say.
Yeah.
Until my late 20s. I would, and the thing that I found really interesting, and I feel incredibly privileged to have been able to experience different cultures around this stuff, especially different English-speaking cultures. The contrast becomes very, very strong when you don't have, a different language to contend with. But living in Canada for a couple of years, and I went even into a country town, and we did a house concert there for a couple of friends of mine and I. And I remember really distinctly, in the midst of my in-between song banter, which I've always prided myself on, saying something about, and this is about this person and they and they and they and they. And this guy, this cis white dude, just jumped up in the middle of the show and goes, hey, you can relax. Just say she. Just say she.
And so were you like mortified, or
I
were
was
you
shocked.
relieved?
I mean, it was like I had like, because the thing is, I mean, people's intention is quite clear, in their tone, and it came from such a loving place where he was so clearly pained for me, watching me struggle with this farce, because I just felt that I couldn't disclose, and it sort of dropped the veil for me, and everything changed in that moment. And a couple months later, I went back to Melbourne. And I performed at a pub that I've performed at millions of times. And all of I had, a good 150 people there that were all regulars of my music. And I remember it was the first time that I ever started openly speaking about the people that I was dating or that I'd written these songs about, and mentioning their actual pronouns. And I felt the temperature in the room shift. People who had loved me for years, I could feel that it wasn't okay for me to be open.
Oh, wow.
And they'd known me for years. They knew I was gay, but the fact that I was talking about it openly was really uncomfortable for them. So I feel really, really fortunate that I've had those contrasting experiences, because I wouldn't have been able to clock the level of homophobia that I was growing up with, and misogyny that I was growing up with, that I can safely say that a massive motivating factor of leaving Australia was to get away from those limiting beliefs that I have had firsthand experience of losing parts of my career to.
That is so fascinating, because I always so for me, when I started performing and when I started writing songs, it's fairly difficult for me to hide my queerness, and so I was just like, well, I'm just gonna have to lean into this, and that absolutely cost me opportunities, and meant that some people just weren't receptive to hearing what I had to say, because it was just some dirty queer shit. But in lots of ways, that's really fortunate, because I didn't have to go through that experience of like having people turn away from me who I thought were allies.
Right.
So yeah, I'm sorry that's shit.
Oh, thanks. It's honestly, I take it as a gift. I think, as a cis passing person and a very, very white person, I've had so few blatant experiences of the disadvantages that I've experienced being queer. And so I think that it's a gift, much like any blatant trauma, to have a very clear understanding of why these things have happened so you can actually do something about it. I think when it's more subtle, if I'd stayed in Australia, if I'd never left, I probably would have similar rhetoric to a lot of people that I was around, pre-internet explosion, that it's just like, oh no, this is just the way it is. Come on, she'll be right, kind of thing. And then you just kind of get along and you just expect that, okay, well, this is just difficult. This is the kind of difficult that it is for everyone. Whereas now I know it's like, no, in fact, this is something that we need to fight to change.
Yeah.
This is something that I've experienced firsthand and it's unacceptable. Whereas before I wouldn't have noticed, I thought it was perfectly acceptable for me to fucking have to hide who I was for so long.
Yeah.
No matter how flimsy it was, but I thought it was acceptable because that's just what you do when you're learning to survive,
Yeah, and it's your fault. It's not everyone else's fault for being bigoted. It's your fault because it's my fault put it because in their face.
But I have a choice because it's such a waste that I'm not, gagging on cock all the time. Like I have a choice. I could choose to, that's a lot of people used to say that to me, that I had a choice.
But you also you can't like be too slutty. You have to be like the acceptable realms of slutty when you're gagging on cock. Just like to put that out there.
I know.
I just need to remind you.
Yeah. It's only, there's a certain level of slut that is acceptable in society. Yeah, I mean it's
so tedious. But so we like. If we're talking about going to the Glasshouse, sorry, were you then always, having a certain level of fame, were you always feeling uncomfortable there, or that someone might recognize you?
Well, I don't know. I don't know if uncomfortable is the right word. My ego was a pretty big component of my daily life back then. So being recognized or deemed as a little bit more special than other people was one of my goals at the time. So I wouldn't say that there was any fear around people treating me differently in that respect. And, most of and this is the thing that's so baffling about being in the music industry, and especially at the time being a female identified human doing, acoustic singer-songwriter shit. It was par for the course to have a room full of lesbians in the space. It's just, that was it. The majority of my
and me audience, as well.
Yeah. Yes, of course. So, it's so weird, this facade of like pretending that we're not who we are, because everybody knows. It's just that you just don't talk about it. So I mean, going to any queer spaces at the time was fairly complicated for me, because I was in this sort of like this dual world where I was still trying to figure out who I was by being in these spaces, while also trying to hide who I was by being in all of the spaces that I felt that I already fit into. Mm-hmm. So, going to the Glasshouse, and, there were a couple times where I would get there, and when I was dating my first serious girlfriend at the time, being refused entry because I didn't look gay enough.
Oh, wow.
That happened twice.
It's never happened to me.
Well, all you got to do is grow your hair long and have big tits, love, and you'll be fine. Or yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah. And I had that happen a couple times.
And even though you were with your girlfriend.
Yeah, and having these moments of going, do I need to like make out with her in front of you? Like what proof do you need? And this is a butch dyke standing at the door refusing us entry. So there was very much a sense of if you fit in, you couldn't be part of it. And I feel so fortunate that I had found music when I did, because that was never a question. if you wanted to play, you could play. Whereas being gay felt like you had to qualify.
But there's a whole other set of kind of conditions if you're in a space with musicians performing, and especially if you're female presenting.
Well, yeah. I mean, that's just the case of living in Australia. To a large part. It's just a big part of just being in Australian culture. So I wouldn't have taken that as being any kind of, I mean, definitely there have been the majority of experiences that I've had in my life of playing with male identified musicians has been that they just treat me like I don't know what I'm talking about. But that's something that I got used to from. Well, it's just that's just how it is, and it wasn't until I started working with musicians in North America where I started taking my own ideas seriously and starting to recognise that, the toxic masculinity in Australia is so pervasive that the men don't even realise how much they don't take me seriously.
Oh wow!
So I mean, it just does. It all felt very par for the course for it to be difficult to find a space to fit in, in Australia. And I would imagine that would be very similar for a lot of people who have had the opportunity to see it from an outside perspective, from living in other cultures. But we're just so easygoing about it that you just kind of brush it off, right? We just keep going. You don't make a fuss about it because it's been trained into us that that's not something worth fussing about.
Yeah. But and there's that kind of perverse thing of if you're the one making the fuss, then you're the problem. You're not 100%. Identifying the problem. You are the problem.
Right.
Yeah.
And hence why when I'm standing at the door and they're telling me that I can't come in because I'm not gay enough, I'm like, okay, so how do I make myself gay? Or how do I, or is this really the space for me? Rather than being like, well, fuck you, let me in. All I want to do is drink around a bunch of queers and let me do that. But
do you want me to show you how good I am at pool?
Yeah. Let me prove that I'm gay. Watch me own you on this fucking pool table, regardless of how many balls there are. Yeah.
Oh wow! And then so how do you I'm assuming you went back after being refused.
Yeah, I think once I gained a bit more confidence, and these were in the early days that I was living in Melbourne, and I'd just started dating my partner at the time, and she was studying gender at university, so I got to sort of learn all these things about queer theory and bits and pieces about feminist theory and things. So I started to kind of get a little bit more activism in me and get a bit more staunch about my identity and such. So I went back to the Glasshouse, but then, started to find other spaces that were a lot more inclusive. And so there was this place in Collingwood called the Builders Arms where they ran this night on Thursdays called Q&A, Queer and Alternative. And that felt cool because it was like it felt more like a voluntary participation kind of thing, that it wasn't like you walk into a room and then you're this. It was that you go into a space and everybody's dancing and you don't know who's going to be there and you don't know, it felt a lot more queer rather than just like a bunch of lesbians and a bunch of gay guys.
And so why do you think that is? Is it Q&A was held in a normally not queer space, and it was once a week queer, and it was mixed gender, so it wasn't leaning on a particular gender.
Yeah, and I think because the organisers had sort of set it up as queer and alternative, it wasn't like it was an alternative culture event. So the people who kind of, I've always found it really interesting about because I have a lot of friends who are 10 to 20 years younger than me, and so we have a lot of conversations about being queer in the age of the internet versus not, because the contrast is so magnificent. And I think that I've always found it really interesting that spaces, and it was super necessary, right? It was really necessary to make these spaces so people could meet one another and find, other queers and such. But having that contrast of being in a music community versus a queer community at the time, it was always so baffling to me that you would get in a room and everybody would just, socialize based on the assumption that we all have things in common purely because we're all attracted to people of the same gender. And so to not have actual common interests outside of that, you sort of get this alcoholic culture that are just all getting fucked up and kind of fucking each other because that's really the space that you're in. But then when you start to see these more alternative spaces opening up, and what's so wonderful about some of the spaces in New York, like down the road here, there's a place called the House of Yes, that their policy and their whole concept of their venue is around consent. And so like you have to basically sign a waiver upon entry that says that you won't touch anyone, you won't approach anyone, you won't do anything without specifically asking for consent first. You're not allowed to take photos of people, like laying down all of these standard procedures of how to create a safe space. And as a result of that, this space is so inclusive that you just feel safe, and you feel safe to be whatever you are. And I think that I've always really wanted spaces like that where it's just like no one gives a shit. No one gives a shit. You just be who you are. You'll meet other people that have fought to be who they are. And that gives you a really diverse range of humans to socialize with. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's always been something that I really craved as a young queer person, was not a space where I get to slot into a category and adjust my personality and, you know, get the Birkenstocks and the studded belt and dye my hair.
And Indigo Girl CDs.
Indigo Girl CDs and Ani DeFranco and, you know, and wear the tank tops and the leather cuffs and things like that, which I did. But to have a space where we get to push into all of these beautiful different aspects of who we are, because it's such a – identity is such a complex thing. And I think as we get to look at Gen Zers and all of these wonderful young people who have access to information and the capacity to mold it into these fantastical new concepts, we're starting to notice that the complexities of human expression, it just wouldn't work to have these really super binary spaces for queer people anymore, because we don't, especially now that I guess for me, I was craving representation of like all of the different facets of who I am, because my gender's never sat in one spot. I learned really, really diligently to perform my gender female, because that's what I felt that I had to do. Mm-hmm. But now what? What sort of space would I fit in now? If we went back to the 90s and there's a dyke bar around the corner and then there's the gay bar over the road, where the fuck do I go?
Mm. Mm. But and so is that what you're saying, that like queer and alternative kind of was that space for you?
Yeah, it felt like that. You know, I had friends that didn't sit in the binary parts of the spectrum, that we'd all meet up there, and there was no conversation about it. It was just, we're at this really fun thing and I get to be here with all my friends who, some of them happen to be a bit queer and some of them don't. And if I hit on a girl over there, she's probably going to be into it, you know, rather than going, okay, cool. So we're in a dyke bar. Everybody's going to fuck each other at some point. Who hasn't fucked who? Like, how do we pick this so that we don't cross-pollinate and turn it into drama? You know, so I think... and
how do I indicate that I want to play pool next?
Yeah, exactly. How do I do that without getting...
What is the etiquette?
What is the etiquette?
Yeah.
Oh, I used to be, you put a coin down, right? And then you just like strut around like you're the witch that knows what's going on. And then you buy your pint of beer and stare at the table until you intimidated someone.
Oh.
Yeah, those were the days. Yeah, but like I think, you know, as much as I met my first girlfriend at Q&A, yeah, it was when text messaging first started.
Ooh.
It was like,
and why do you say that?
Well, it was the day my very first text message that I received was from her going, "I see you," across the bar. And I was like, what the fuck is going on with my phone? And I was like, there's a text here from this Alex person? That's interesting.
Wait, okay. So she had...
Oh, no, we had met before that. Hang on.
Oh, okay.
We had met in a bar. We had met. And I tell you, I walked up to her and the first thing I said to her, no, because it was at Q&A. I actually did meet her at Q&A. She was in the bathroom, or I saw her walk past, and I had seen her some weeks before at a different bar, and she just flitted by, and I was like, oh, my God. And then the second time I saw her was at Q&A, and I walked up to her and I shook her hand and I said, "You are the most beautiful woman I've ever seen, and I'm buying you a drink." And smooth. She goes, yeah, oh man, I was so smooth back then. And she goes, she's like, "Well, I already have a drink waiting for me, but thank you. And I said, cool, I'll buy you another one. And I just grabbed her by the hand and I drug her to the bar and I sat her down and I bought her a second drink right in front of the girl that she was with. Mm-hmm. I was a smart ass bitch back then. And then I got her number. So then the second time that she turned up at Q&A, she texted me and I hadn't seen her since that night. So, but then there was like a whole 3 months of stalking afterwards and a whole bunch of other stuff. So it wasn't as romantic as it sounds. It was quite messy, as those kinds of beginnings tend to be.
Well, yeah. I mean, when you're that age. Oh, that sounds really patronizing. But so then the reason that you hadn't been in touch between those two nights, was it because you were like cool and like, oh yeah, maybe I'll be in touch? Or
no, I think I was just like such a, I don't know. She was very hard to get for a long time. She played very hard to get for a long time. She wasn't that interested. She was more interested in meaner people at the time.
Oh,
it's funny. We're good friends now, so it's funny to think back about it.
Isn't it fascinating, like the energy that you would have for that kind of thing when you were younger? Now I'm like, yeah, okay, this is too hard. Bye.
I know. Like I talked to my younger friends who were sort of in the thick of all of that shit and the drama. It's like, you have to go through it, mate, but I do not envy you at all. I think that the haze of confusion around like how to be happy or how to feel connected or how to be valid in that time, everything is so heightened.
Yeah, but also like getting it right, I think. Like,
when does that happen?
Well, exactly. Like, you get to a point where you're like, oh, yeah, that isn't the point. Like, you're not going to get it right. But when you're a certain age or when you're like new to romance, it's like, right, I need to find the one and I need to lock it in.
No. And suck it dry and ruin each other. And repeat the same patterns over and over and over again.
But it's fine because we look happy externally.
I don't know if I ever did. Thank God.
So you weren't in Australia at the time. Do you remember hearing about Q&A closing?
Yeah, I do remember hearing about it closing. I remember, once the internet came along and people started relying on dating apps, it just sort of, I remember reading an article probably 5 or 6 years ago about queer spaces throughout the world disappearing as a result of a lot of these apps and such. I'm not 100% surprised. I think, like as I was saying, I think as culture sort of diversifies and we sort of become a lot more, ultimately I think the greater arc of our human evolution at this point in time is one away from the binary, in so many ways. Like we're sort of seeing this huge shift away from being separate. We're starting to all be forced to stare at our singularity as a energy body, that we're all part of the one. So I think it makes perfect sense that these spaces that sort of thrived upon segregation kind of have to disappear. And I think that while it's a massive shame that we're losing the nostalgia for these moments where we got shown a certain kind of freedom, I think that to make real lasting freedom, that these are some of the sacrifices that need to be made.
And so then what do you think is the replacement?
I think it's spaces like the House of Yes.
Okay.
I think it's spaces like what you see in New York and that you've seen in New York for a long time where, queerness is the frosting on a community of creatives. Because more often than not, we are the people who live on the fringes of society because we have to. And so from that vantage point, we have more to say. We've got more critical thinkers because we're forced to be. So to just identify us by the people that we sleep with, I think is really, really limiting when we can be identified by the valuable contributions that we can give to society from a vantage point of being excluded but still passing, or included and still excluded, and, to have sympathies with communities that are different to us because we're used to being different.
Yeah. And so what happens then when integration's a horrible term to use at this time, but like what happens when queerness is more integrated into the mainstream and there isn't that otherness necessarily that you experience?
Well, I think it just depends on which parts of society. I think there's always going to be ingrained fear of otherness. I think that that's just how we survive. That's how humans are wired. But I think that as the conversation gets wider, I believe that people who would otherwise identify themselves as exclusively straight don't anymore. I think that the more that we're exposed to one another, the more we start to realize how alike we are. Mm-hmm. And I think there's always going to be spaces where people feel safe to just be, around other people that sit in a closer identity space with one another. But we're heading that way. We have to all be able to see each other as the same. And I mean, with the systemic racism that we're all kind of looking at the moment, it's the same thing. Like you look around, it's like, oh shit, we are actually all one race. Mm. We are all one race. We've always been one race. This segregation by color was created during the Spanish Inquisition. This was something that was created to identify people on site, whether or not they were Christians. It was manufactured to control and make money. It's not an inherent human behavior. Neither is to segregate us by sexuality or gender. These are all constructs. And as these constructs fail, we'll start to see that it's all a lot muddier and a lot grayer than we give it credit for. Mm-hmm. It's just that we struggle to let go of those concepts because we don't quite understand how to free fall without dying. We don't know how to surrender without sacrificing everything that we trust. So I just think that anything away from what we've known is just a step further towards this future that we get to manifest in whatever shape we think is most awesome. So, and I think that that's what our job is moving forward, is to start believing that there are possibilities beyond what we've seen before, because it's the only thing that can come after all this chaos.
Did you ever go to Q&A? Well, if you did, I would love to hear from you. Tell me your stories and share any photos or anecdotes you have through social media. You can find me on all platforms, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, under the user handle KAndersonMusic. And you can find out more about Jess at www.jessmcavoy.com. Lost Spaces is not only a podcast, but a concept record as well. I've been writing songs about queer venues and the people who used to live their lives there, and will be releasing songs over the coming year. You can hear the first single, Well Groomed Boys, which is also playing underneath my talking right now on all good streaming platforms. If you like this episode, I would really appreciate if you subscribed, left a review on Apple Podcasts, or just told people who you think might be interested. I am Kay Anderson, and you've been listening to Lost Spaces.